We're very privileged to have a number of distinguished speakers, but including Assistant Secretary Henry Bensurto, who has, I think, some PowerPoint slides, which is different from every other presentation. So we want to move right into your presentation, Henry, please.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for the organizers. I think it's good to have a forum like this to engage on a very sensitive issue. I'd like to preface the presentation by joining my ambassador in thanking you, as my family was directly hit with the super typhoon, and personally from the bottom of our heart, we would like to express our gratitude to the United States, actually, for the outpouring of support in the international community in that regard. So thank you again. The presentation, I've titled it, A Rules-Based Approach in the South China Sea, Challenges and Response. I will go through the presentation very quickly, following this outline. I'll talk about the challenges first, and then from there, the Philippine response to the challenge, and then I'll make my conclusion, essentially. So let me walk you through the South China Sea first. Let me introduce you. You've seen the South China Sea, but perhaps this is another perspective. So what you see here is actually the South China Sea as a semi-enclosed sea, bordered by several littoral states, China to the north, Vietnam to the west, Brunei, Malaysia, and the Philippines, essentially. It has access to the Pacific Ocean to your right of the screen. Now, if you apply the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is actually about maritime entitlements, what you see here are actually the extents of their maritime entitlements in terms of the 200 nautical miles exclusive economic zone. If you notice, it would have been easy to address those overlaps. If you notice, there are actually overlaps to the north, even to the south. And in terms of these overlaps, actually, UNCLOS provides the provisions by which this could be addressed. As you may have noted, 200 nautical miles exclusive economic zone is a prima facie right, prima facie in the sense that it's subject to delimitation. And international law, both in terms of the text of the United Nations Convention and the Law of the Sea, and even case law, provides certain principles by which they could be delimited. And as you can see, they could have been easily delimited. However, in the case of the South China Sea, what makes it very difficult for delimitation to happen is essentially because in addition to what is provided for under the United Nations Convention and the Law of the Sea, in the case of our neighbor in the north, they have this expansive claim, which has been termed now popularly as the 9-dash line. Actually, now it's 10-dash line. It used to be 11 before, then became 9. Now it's back to 10. The reason is there's another dot that was actually put up there near Taiwan beginning this year. And this explains the reason why it's very difficult to actually have a delimitation. In this situation, how are you going to have that delimitation? This claim also is very expansive, as you may have noted, because it actually encroaches on about 75 to 80% of our exclusive economic zone in the West Philippine Sea, that of Malaysia, Brunei, even Indonesia, actually, and Vietnam. More or less on the average about 70 to 80%. And not only that, but even the high seas, if you notice, this area is actually high seas. And so that essentially explains why the international community has a lot of interest in the area as well. So it's not just the littoral states. This situation also explains, from our perspective, why joint development that is devoid of the geographic context could actually result into more problems unless you do the clarification. Because in this situation, when you actually occupy 85% of the exclusive economic zone of another country based on an expansive claim, it makes a lot of sense for that country to actually make joint development as a proposition, as a provisional measure. It's like if I like Cronan's suit, which obviously is his because he's wearing it, but because I like it, I will claim it. And because I am more powerful than Patrick because I have a 45, now that I claim it, we have a right to that suit. And therefore, but because I am generous, Patrick, we can actually share your suit. You can wear it today, but tomorrow I have to wear it. And in that way, we share your suit. This is the concept of joint development that we think is not the right way. And so from our perspective, therefore, in this context, joint development without clarification would result to more problems in the future. And so the problem essentially in the South China Sea is essentially the crux of the problem from our perspective is this expansive claim. But at the same time, you can browse over the globe and you will see that there are hundreds of disputes spread across the globe. And many of these disputes are actually benign. But the problem in the South China Sea is that it's not benign. It's active, it's breathing, actually. And it did not just happen 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Let me explain. I'm sorry, let me backtrack. The other problem in the South China Sea in relation to the expansive is that not only is it ambiguous, but at the same time, you do not know whether the dispute in this area is generated by the 9-dash line or because there are features here that project certain maritime entitlements. The problem with this ambiguity is you cannot pinpoint the problem. Once you're cornered in one situation, then you can go to the other. And so this ambiguity serves a purpose for whoever makes that ambiguous claim. Actually, one may be anchored on the international law, but the other one may not be. So depending on the situation, you can actually go from one justification to another. And so there is that necessity, therefore, of clarifying that. Now, let me go back to the point where I said, in this situation, but the problem in the SPRATLYS is that it's not just claimed by one country, it's claimed by several countries. And the situation on the ground is that those features are actually occupied by various countries. You can see that Malaysia, for example, occupies 5, China 7, Taiwan 1, Philippines 9, Vietnam 21. And so you will see in the board through the various coloring code how these features are occupied. And let me just give you an idea how these features look like. So in the case of China, these are the occupied reefs and racks of China, and this is how they look like. I'll just go fast. And therefore, it is very important to clarify this in terms of Article 121 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Because it's noteworthy that in the UN, in terms of the extended continental shelf, for example, China questioned Okotorishima as a rack and therefore not capable of projecting 200. And yet, when you go to the South China Sea, where the features are very similar, you have a different perspective from China. And so I think it is very important, therefore, to have a standard, to have a clarification, exactly what is the character of these features and what exactly is the extent of their maritime entitlements. Let me just walk you through also the various features occupied by the Philippines. Oh, by the way, this is the ship that came out in the New York Times. I'm just going fast there because maybe the Q&A would clarify some of the issues. But I did not show the others, but this is just to give you an overview of how those features look like. So as you can see, they're small. Now, I said the crux of the problem is the 9-dash line. But the second problem, why tension is generated in the South China Sea, is essentially because those disputes are living. The claim, that expansive claim, is very active, actually. And I said earlier that it did not happen just 2 years ago. Let me give you an idea. It happened many years ago, and you will see the pattern. Every decade or so, something happens. And when something happens, diplomacy is applied so the tension goes down, but then they're there. And then from there, a decade after or so, tension will again rise because there's a movement, and then diplomacy is applied, goes down. Let me explain it this way. In the 70s, for example, Parasols was taken over by force. We don't have a claim here. It's an area disputed between Vietnam and China, but we never raised a voice here because it did not concern us at the time. Little did we know later on that we could find ourselves at the end of the totem pole, actually, and that's the thing. So a decade after, in the 80s, there was a bloody confrontation between the Vietnamese and the Chinese in Fiery Cross Reef. Several naval sailors from Vietnam actually died in the process, and 3 features were physically occupied by China. Again, we did not raise a thing about this because it's between Vietnam and China. Little did we know that we will be the subject of that later on. And true enough, in the 1990s, Mischief Reef was physically occupied. And for the first time, Scarborough Shoal was threatened. But as you may have noted, it's a different color because they were not successful with respect to Scarborough Shoal at the time. It was just in Mischief Reef that it was totally and completely overtaken and physically occupied. Then a decade after, you have this situation in the Reed Bank, actually. Let me take note, because, and I think this is very important in terms of the analysis, because we hear a lot of suggestions for joint development, cooperation, building confidence, and it's a problem of trust. What if it's not really a question of trust, because the message is very clear, this is ours? What if in this situation, the tension in the Reed Bank happened not at the time that we don't trust each other? On the contrary, this is the golden age of Philippine-China relations, in fact. So it begs a question, therefore, as to the value. I'm not against cooperation, Mark, but they have to be treated in the right way. Because the situation in the South China Sea, the problem is not the tension. Tension is just a manifestation of the real problem. Those tension is caused by something else. And you can have palliatives, you can have painkillers, and after a while, they will work. But if you don't address the main problem, they will come back to you, and one day, your tooth will be extracted. And this is also how it is in the South China Sea. For a time, we kind of live with this pattern of tension, confidence, and then after 2010, not only was Reed Bank threatened, but areas 3 and 4, and then even the 9 All Blacks within the 200 of Vietnam, then the fishing ban. If you will divide the South China Sea into 4 quadrants, from 1997 to 2012, it was only Vietnam that was threatened. It was just the first quadrant. By last year, it was the 2 quadrants now. And then Ayungin Shoal is threatened, and then finally we're here. The message to our Malaysian neighbor, we're here in James Shoal. So this is the situation essentially in the South China Sea over a period of 3 or 4 decades. And I think from our perspective, we have to address this more than those simple joint exercise, those simple exchange of information. We have to go beyond that now, actually, because if we continue with this, if you notice, over a period of time, they are consistent in terms of affirming the 9-dash line. So in a way, these activities affirm, they are always an advancement of a claim. As you can see, it's pretty consistent now with the 9-dash line. So how do we respond to this, therefore, from the Philippine perspective? And we have a three-track approach, essentially. And this three-track approach is essentially we proposed the zone of peace, friendship, freedom, and cooperation. I will explain this later. And then the code of conduct in the South China Sea, because our basic approach is that it has to be a rules-based approach, because it levels the playing field between a small and a big country, actually. And the rule of law is the way forward from our perspective. And finally, the third track is arbitration. Let me explain each of these. The ZOFIC is essentially taken from Deng Xiaoping's principle of shelving territorial dispute and engage in cooperation. But how do you operationalize that principle? It starts with the basic definition of territorial dispute. What exactly is territorial dispute? Does it concern the whole of the South China Sea, or is it limited to those features? And from our perspective, it's very important to make a distinction between territory and maritime claims, or territorial disputes from maritime disputes. Why? Because it is harder to address territorial disputes, but maritime disputes would be much easier. So from this, our analysis, therefore, is that the maritime dispute can be segregated from the territorial dispute. And by making this distinction, it makes it now operationally possible to shelve territorial dispute. How? So from our perspective, the territorial dispute is essentially limited to the features. The question of who owns the features. This is a territory, and the question there is who owns the territory. We don't have to address that question now, but we can actually segregate it by first identifying the land as the first point in defining territorial dispute, but at the same time, he who owns the island also owns the sea, to the extent that UNCLOS provides what is the entitlement of that land. This is based on the principle of land dominating the sea. And so from this perspective, any land, therefore, would be entitled to territorial waters. And the territorial waters is an extension of the territory. So therefore, if you are going to define territorial dispute, it will be first the land feature or the rock feature, whatever it is, plus the territorial waters around it. From our perspective, this is the territorial dispute. And so by doing that, we can now actually segregate these features and engage in cooperation that is within those disputed territorial areas. We can also now engage in the areas outside of those territorial disputes. Part 13 actually could now be applied, or Part 9, where in a semi-enclosed sea, the convention encourages states to engage in cooperation. But in the context of the South China Sea with the expansive 9-9, that makes it very difficult. With this formula, it makes it now possible to categorize cooperation outside of the disputed area and cooperation within the disputed area. Now, the second track, the second approach we're taking here, consistent with the rules-based, is actually the code of conduct. It's very interesting to note that this code of conduct has been the subject of discussion, but it never really took off the ground until last year when ZOFIC was put on the table. Suddenly, to shelve the ZOFIC, code of conduct was put on the table so that it was to draw attention to the code of conduct. We agreed. But as soon as we agreed on the code of conduct last year, in the middle of the ASEAN meetings, we were told that, at the right time, when the time is right. And so nothing happened. But finally, after arbitration was filed early this year, code of conduct took off again. And so after the meeting in Suzhou, it was now agreed that in the meetings of the Joint Working Group and the implementation of the Declaration of Conduct on the South China Sea, that the Code of Conduct will now be a regular subject of those meetings. And I think that's a very good indication on the prospect of this Code of Conduct. Now let me go straight now to our third leg, which is the arbitration. Our reading of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, Part 15, is that it provides us a menu of choices when there is a dispute between parties with respect to the interpretation and the application of UNCLOS. And the four menus, the four choices essentially, is to bring that dispute either to the International Court of Justice, the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, or arbitration under Annex 7 or special arbitration. Now, the difference between UNCLOS and other agreements is that compulsory arbitration, compulsory adjudication is the general rule. In fact, this is the reason why in UNCLOS, reservation is not allowed. It is only allowed as you go through Part 15. So this is the general rule, but then as you go through that general rule and Part 15, by the way, if you don't make a choice, you can indicate what choice you want the dispute to be settled. But if there is no choice, the rule is it's Annex 7 arbitration. If one party chose arbitration and the other party did not make a choice or chooses another, it will be arbitration. So the default mechanism is actually arbitration under Annex 7 of the Convention. So there is compulsory jurisdiction here, even if the other party who is, and I like to emphasize, even if the party does not wish to participate, provided that party is a signatory to the convention. In the case of the South China Sea, both the Philippines and China are signatories to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But this is the exception to that rule. When a party makes a reservation, you cannot bring that party with respect to those specific reservations. And those reservations under Part 15 are allowed in 3 instances. When the issue is about military operation, and second, it's about maritime delimitation, and third is when the issue is before the United Nations Security Council. Now, outside of these 3 reservations, the general rule or the residual rule of compulsory jurisdiction applies. So the question, therefore, in this issue is, how do you phrase the issue that you're going to bring before the tribunal? If the issue that you are bringing forth before the tribunal is within the 3 reservations, then there's no jurisdiction. But if you if you pose a question to the tribunal that is outside of these 3 reservations, the general rule applies. There is a 4th exclusion, actually. Anything that concerns territorial sovereignty is also outside of the jurisdiction. This is given. Why? Because UNCLOS is about waters. It's not into territorial questions, actually. So if the question that you pose before the tribunal is who owns the features, that cannot be a subject of the tribunal's jurisdiction. But if you phrase your question whether or not that feature, is it a rock, is it an island, or is it a low tide elevation, then that is an interpretation and application of the provisions of the convention, and it's very important. Let me just give you an update. We tried to settle this matter between us and China, actually, and this took some time. But as you may have noted, it has not abated the tension in the South China Sea. And therefore, after, from our perspective, exhausting all possible ways by which we can address this on a negotiated way, we have come to the conclusion that the only way to approach this now is to avail of the facilities of the Part 15 of the Convention. And so we finally filed our arbitration. We extended our invitation to China several times because we would have wanted this matter to be a consensual agreement between the two of us. But at the end of the day, since we could not get that, we have no choice but to do it ourselves. We are not seeking the resolution of any territorial questions. We're not asking the court to answer the question of who owns the features. Rather, we are asking the convention first. We are challenging the 9-dash line. From our perspective, it is not consistent with the provisions of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Second, we're asking the tribunal to actually clarify the various maritime entitlements, not just us, but including China, because we both have maritime entitlements. And then third, we would want the tribunal to actually clarify the characters of the features. The panel has been constituted. It's now complete. It's a 5-member panel. Thomas Mensah is the president of the tribunal. He's a former president of the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea as well. The rules of procedure has also been finalized, and the Philippines has been given the deadline of March 30 next year to submit our memorial. Now, what are the challenges that we face? This arbitration has been facing a lot of pressure. There are pressure for us to drop the tribunal. Since I've been given 2 minutes, I'll just make the general statement that we are committed to this. We are not going to backtrack from this approach, regardless of what. The train has left the station. Let it therefore proceed to its logical conclusion. And from our perspective, at the end of the day, once the arbitration is decided, it will actually redound to the benefit not only of the Philippines, but including China. Because for China, it will now clarify essentially what their entitlements are. It will also clarify what are entitlements. And for the rest of the international community, it will also clarify what their entitlements are and assure freedom of navigation and all the other rights and obligations between maritime users and coastal states. And so, from our perspective, this is the good that will ultimately come out of this arbitration. Thank you very much, Patrick. Maybe in the Q&A if you have questions later on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Henry, thank you very much for a very comprehensive presentation. I need to say up front that because I work for the United States Navy, these are my personal views I'm about to give and not a representative of official policy of the Navy or any other agency of the US government. There are 4 points I'd like to quickly make about dispute resolution and what international law can contribute. The first is, I'd like to start with talking a little bit about UNCLOS itself as a treaty or convention. I believe that it's important for the United States, as it is important for all states, to support and defend the system developed under UNCLOS. Why? Because I believe it's the key to a stable global maritime order and the health of the global economic and security system that underpins this order. So. It's important. This point is so important to me that I both want to begin my remarks by emphasizing it, that we need to support and defend the UNCLOS system for the well-being of everyone. I'm also going to end with it with a slightly different twist. Let's think first about the history of the development of UNCLOS. Its purpose over the course of the negotiations over the course of the 20th century, really almost a century's worth of negotiations, was to relieve a patchwork, a chaos of various types of maritime claims around the world that were developed in response to a number of stimuli. In 1958 and then later in 1982, it resulted in conventions, but as we know, really it wasn't until 1994 that the final negotiations were completed. So this framework provided order by institutionalizing economic and security disputes at sea. That's the key. It was a global institutionalization of what could have been continuing conflict at sea for the rest of, till today. Why did we get this negotiation process? Why was it that the international community was able to come together at this time? One, I think, is that there was an opportunity after World War II in particular to recognize that the value of certainty outweighed the value of maintaining individual national claims, right? So having a system to provide certainty now became the priority. Second, I think we have to point to the technology advancements, right, that enabled a greater ability to utilize both the living and the non-living resources at sea. And third, there was a period after World War II of relative global peace and global stability, at least among the great powers. And so UNCLOS, there was a particular opportunity in time for UNCLOS to establish an institutionalized dispute resolution mechanism to avoid conflicts at sea and to establish a consistent approach to claims that balance the interest of all states. And it's not just maritime claims to resources, but in addition to the claims of uses of the sea, right? The balance of rights and obligations between the coastal states and the international community as well. So this system is worth defending and protecting, in my view. There are a whole series of questions we can save for the Q&A, if you like, that come for this. But for instance, what about the commitment to arbitrate under UNCLOS? That's worth talking about. Second, would China ever litigate? That's also worth talking about. A third question, what if the parties distrust international law or distrust the international tribunals? What could be done then? So there are some things that can be talked about in regards to how UNCLOS can help move these things forward, including my second point, which is temporary measures. There are dispute resolution aids, I'll call them, within UNCLOS that include the opportunity for temporary measures. We see the Dutch actually pursuing this right now, this opportunity right now, and I'm frankly surprised that it hasn't been pursued more actively by some of the parties in the South China Sea as a way of at least helping, at least allowing the international framework to work to reduce tensions around specific cases. So the second point I'd like to make, the first is the importance of UNCLOS as a dispute resolution mechanism that all states have an interest in supporting. And the second is that there are actually frameworks within UNCLOS that are yet to be actively tried in Asia as an opportunity to bring the tension down. The third point I'd like to make is about the power of the norm. That even where dispute resolution mechanisms are unavailable or unwilling to be tried, both reputation and reciprocity are powerful motivators in the international system. To be effective, frankly, this requires cooperation among the relevant parties with international law. That is to say, the more one state conforms its measures to international law, the more it's able to provide that sort of leadership that sheds light on the failure of other states around it to do so. Right? So all states have an interest in bringing themselves closer and closer to international law as a way to lead the system by example. And frankly, I want to say I think the Philippines has done an extraordinary job overcoming some real political difficulties over the last decade as it's developed its mechanisms to bring its claims into closer alignment with international law of the sea. And I hope the Philippines continues with that track and finishes the job. Let me just say it that way, in alignment with international law. I do think it's important that all states, however, work together in order to build the power of the norm and thereby to make that norm so strong that it becomes more and more difficult for states to remain on the wrong side of it. And so in that sense, I frankly think there's room for improvement in Southeast Asia. In moving forward, all states have an opportunity in Southeast Asia, all states, to conform their claims closer and closer to international norms, and then that will then put more pressure on those states who remain outside to bring themselves into conformity. So there's a political component as well that states need to work together, in my opinion. That's the third point. And the fourth point is looking at the dynamics in the South China Sea right now. My view, depending on what you call it, I call it China's non-militarized coercion. It is coercion in China's approach to its claims in both the East and South China Sea. I've seen it described among the Chinese as a cabbage strategy and also as the Scarborough model. I've seen it described by the Chinese as that as well. What that reminds us of is that power can be successful, but it builds systemic tension. Quite clear. It builds systemic tension. And so one of the tensions one of the ways of relieving that tension is to go back to my third point, which is more and more conformity among states to international law puts pressure back on the non-conforming state to begin to conform itself more appropriately and to use international law rather than power to resolve disputes in its favor. So another point that I'd like to make in this regard is that law can also make bilateral negotiations more effective. So in addition to the power of the norm and having a sort of reflecting light into the international system and shedding light on those who are failing to live by the norm, there's also the ability to raise the stakes in bilateral negotiations by using international law. Certainly, arbitration does one of those things. And what I hope is that the Philippine arbitration will also create, in addition to creating an opportunity for litigation, I hope it creates an opportunity for better negotiations between China and the Philippines as well. So law can make bilateral negotiations more effective, and conformity with norms can make multilateral negotiations more effective. In other words, the law has power even outside tribunals. So, for instance, I can recommend a number of things that the United States should do, I think, in this regard. We will leave aside the whole question of acceding to UNCLOS. You probably have heard me speak on this before and are sick to death of hearing it. But I will, I guess, just say one more time that the United States can put the power of the American example behind this aspect of international law by acceding to the convention, and I hope it does at the soonest opportunity. But even failing that, because law is so much more than a direct dispute resolution measure, it provides that indirect support for bilateral and multilateral negotiations. It can be enhanced through other mechanisms. For instance, the United States government, in my opinion, should officially criticize the 9-dash line. Right? That should be a critique should be written in order to officially state that the 9-dash line, which has been used by China in international communications to the United Nations, and therefore it's fair game for discussion. The United States, in my view, should issue a public statement about this. And to the extent that this line does not comply with UNCLOS, the United States should publicly state so, and should also publicly state that we, the United States, don't agree with it. Second, I will also make the same point about China's continental shelf claim in the East China Sea. It's very difficult to square that East China Sea continental shelf claim with existing international law, at least with 30 years of litigation in the International Court of Justice. It's very difficult to do that. So that would be another area ready for critique. Additionally, concerning sovereignty claims, if the U.S. retains neutrality concerning territorial disputes, and I recognize that there are good policy reasons for doing so, then at least my view is that the U.S. should reemphasize that dispute resolution must occur without coercion. Now, we've done this before. The United States leaders, secretaries of state and others have made that point in the past, but it needs to be, certainly it needs to be made again in light of current events in East Asia. So the United States should reemphasize this and should be prepared to take certain steps to make sure coercion is not effective. I can't say what those individual steps would be, but the United States should support the circumstances on the ground, so to speak, in order to make sure that coercion is not effective. So these are certain things that the United States can do, but all states can do. I want to emphasize that point, that if it's the United States alone that is emphasizing the power of the norm and compliance with the norm, then it's going to be much less effective than if all states together are insisting on conformity with the norm. So to the extent that Japan and Australia and Malaysia and Indonesia and Vietnam and Singapore are not actively pursuing this, then they should be. Right? Because the power is in the collective approach to the norm, not in one individual state, no matter how powerful, approach to the norm. So with that, thank you.
Well, I wanted first to apologize for being late I was up in upstate New York, and air transport is not what it purports to be, so I do apologize to my chairman and others too for just interloping. Let me just offer 2 or 3 real quick comments before we go to our official commentators. And I think that indeed it's a good thing the Philippines is challenging China in a arbitral tribunal. I wonder whether it's a good thing that the U.S. has restricted its own position to simply that we want free navigation through the South China Sea, rather than having eschewing any possible position so far on ownership or territorial claims to islands. It's a abstention which I think is potentially an invitation to mischief. From a scholastic point of view, one interesting question about the Law of the Sea Convention in relation to the South China Sea is whether the treaty itself is meant to be comprehensive, to occupy the field, to preclude any other kind of claim. So when the treaty does permit historic bays and internal waters defined by historic practice, does it mean to preclude historic seas, which is a category that China claims but doesn't exist in the text of the treaty? And I would argue it does. Just if you use the historic in two different instances and omit the third, then by implication it doesn't exist. But it's given, I think, China some running room to be able to say that, well, there are instances where aberrant practice is accommodated for purely historical reasons. I agree with the point, certainly, that if we haven't ratified the convention, we're in a harder position to make an argument about complete compliance. On the other hand, China has. So they've taken the step, and if you sign a treaty, you're expected to conform to it in good faith. The U.S., even though we haven't ratified, obviously is obliged to try to not frustrate the object and purpose of the convention. But it does put us in a weaker position. I do agree with that, to be arguing in favor of jot and tittle observance if we have ourselves not done it. So I think if you look at recent instances of the exercise of U.S. power, this has been a particularly reticent one. And I take the point we have many issues with China, and nobody wants to have a provocation, whether it's the governor of Hainan Island or of Beijing. But there are ways to signal, I think, that are a bit more forward-leaning than what we are currently doing. So I will then turn to my old friend. Oh, excuse me, my friend on the screen. Okay. For our first comment, we'll go to Jay Batongbacal.
Hello, thank you. I will just limit my comments to a few things. I will not repeat what Henry and other commentators have said, because they're all very valid points. What I would like to just add probably is, in the first place, the arbitration case itself is a risk for the Philippines. I mean, it's like a gamble, and that is a very serious move, and we do hope that it results in something very good, and it has the potential to change the situation in the South China Sea from a legal perspective. It's the idea of, well, here locally we call it the dream of making sure that right prevails over might. So it really is about the rule of law. However, that risk is also fraught with a few pitfalls between now, the present, and the time that the tribunal actually makes a decision. And then there are also risks that will be created from the time that the decision is made and onwards into the future. For now, we have seen, for example, the heightened tensions around Second Thomas Shoal, where the cabbage strategy is being implemented. We've also seen how China has attempted to isolate the Philippines from its ASEAN neighbors through its diplomatic initiatives, in which they have, they've touted their cooperation with our neighbors, especially in terms of joint development. And they've come to certain agreements with Vietnam, Brunei, and Malaysia already. Although these are political agreements, they do have a certain role in giving China a softer and more amiable face. The other thing there is the coldness, basically, of the relations now between the Philippines and China. I mean, most observers will agree that the state of relations, it's probably at its lowest at the present, given the as we call it, of the president to the Nanning Expo, and then the delay of China in reacting to the recent disaster here of the typhoon. We've also seen China's push diplomatically with ASEAN. They have now this new initiative which goes hand in hand with the Code of Conduct, which is this Treaty of Good Neighborliness. All of this indicates really a diplomatic, a diplomatic offensive, I hesitate to call it that, but practically a diplomatic offensive to run parallel to this arbitration effort. The thing is, between now and March, I believe that China will try to keep this its good relations with with our neighbors while isolating us, in the hopes that this adds pressure to the Philippines to change its mind about this arbitration. But as Henry said, it is not likely, it is highly unlikely, probably impossible for the Philippines to withdraw its case. Now, the next issue of concern, of course, is the post-arbitration scenario. I do not want to deal with the merits of the case because it really is a very complicated issue. But post-arbitration, whether the Philippines prevails or not, I think we can be sure that the maritime disputes will remain. The complexion of it will change in the sense that at least all the parties will now have the same playing field, in a sense, the same rules to argue about, the same norms to be disputing about. But in terms of the maritime disputes, I mean the situation at sea, it is likely that they will remain, because even if the 9-dash lines are successfully challenged, China still has the option of reverting to an UNCLOS-based maritime zone configuration. And we have seen already from the various statements that they made, particularly the Note Verbal of 2011, they claim, for example, that the Paracels generate the full 200-mile exclusive economic zone, and they claim that the Nansha Islands, or the SPRATLYS, also generate full 200 miles. These are still enough to make the situation at sea a bit problematic, because if they're claiming EEZ rights, the conflicts over fishing, claims over jurisdiction to resources, living, as well as non-living resources through the 200-mile continental shelf, they can still be made, and they can be made plausible by China's positions. So there really is that element to consider. What we have basically is an elimination of one mode of argument on the part of China, but that leaves them with still a couple of other possible bases for arguing. And so a basis for disputes are still there. I think that with respect to the idea that the arbitration will change China's behavior, again, this is also a risk because, number one, it assumes that it assumes that China thinks like us, basically, thinks like the rest of people in the region. But you know, of course, that as a major power in the region, they might have a totally different perspective. Also, the Chinese view of law is quite different from, say, the Western view, especially since they have already been steeped in basically the Communist Party, the communist system, where law is really just an instrument of the state. It's an instrument of policy of the state, and the state can change law as it wills. So there is that different perspective. I think that's why you see China's, for example, the claim to the extended continental shelf in the East China Sea. That is the reason why they've made this claim, which for most people in the West, as well as for the Philippines, this is really an outrageous claim. But as you see, they're using it as an instrument of policy in order to pressure Japan with respect to their disputes. So we will continue to see that now. So even if they do shift to an UNCLOS-based configuration in the South China Sea, they will try to maximize it and push it to the absolute limit, so that we will still continue to have possibility of these kinds of disputes in various areas. But overall, of course, the hope is that this will at least somehow moderate China's behaviors, because it can no longer, say, invoke sovereignty over places as far as what Henry pointed out as areas 3 and 4, or even up close to the islands of Palawan, especially Reed Bank. And that is the hope. but it's a hope that we really need to see. As for the code of conduct and zone of peace, freedom, and cooperation, I think the risk here really is the idea that of separating the territorial disputes from the maritime disputes. And this is one of the key questions for the arbitral tribunal, whether it will be actually possible to do so. Because as you know, the UNCLOS is based, after all, fundamentally on the principle of that the land dominates the sea. The Philippines has invoked that provision against the 9-dash line, and China has invoked that principle against the Philippine arbitration. So this is something that how the tribunal views the application of this principle in the arbitration is actually a key fundamental question that we really will be watching with much anticipation. As for the code of conduct, I think that most scholars here actually expected that China would somehow be open to the code of conduct discussions, not in the sense of coming to an actual agreement, but rather for China to continue to be able to say that there is actually discussion going on, and that as long as people are talking, then there is really no need to prematurely settle the dispute. I think a lot of observers sort of anticipated that eventually China would take the position that it will be the discussions on the code of conduct will probably take much longer. One thing is certain, it is not going to settle the disputes. I think there is not really enough consensus to go as far as settling the territorial disputes in the code of conduct. So really the code of conduct will be more, or its practical value will be more towards, well, the topic of this discussion, which is reduction of risk, reduction of the risk of possible incidents or accidents taking place at sea. As for the, I think with respect to the issue of whether or not we want UNCLOS to prevail, I think everybody does want to do that. I mean, even China has been invoking UNCLOS. The problem, however, is that they also have their own interpretation and application of UNCLOS. As you see from the East China Sea Continental Shelf Claim, and as you see from the way they have also been presenting their arguments against the arbitration, not by participating in the proceedings, but rather through public statements of their ministry or through other means in their mass media. So, in the end, I think, I do join our colleagues in thanking the United States for providing some of the support that has been given. We wish that it would be a little bit more vocal or more concrete, but we also understand that there are constraints on the part of the United States, considering that it also has its relations with China to deal with. It is something that we accept. No? But other than that, I think we probably do need to keep watching every development in the South China Sea, because it does have far-reaching implications to everyone in the region and the rest of the world, really. Thank you.
Let me turn to my very long-standing friend John Bellinger, but just first throw out a few more provocations, if I will, if I may. When we reviewed Hong Kong in the UN Human Rights Committee some years ago, we were made aware that the Chinese view of law is quite different. Americans are used to judicial review. The court speaks, that's the law. There is a review in China of any judicial opinion by the Standing Commission of the People's National Congress. So ultimately, all appeal is to a political branch. And if that's their internal domestic view of law, pace international, you might expect the same sensibility would inform the international sphere as well. A question I'm going to put to John so he can answer it before I ask it, is why do you think China doesn't just, and its neighbors don't just do something very practical and moot out the controversy and do a kind of a Timor-Australia agreement, just make a split. Forget who owns what, just as with Timor, with Peter Galbraith, agreed in that case to it 90-10. They didn't have to worry whether the Timor Gap belonged to Australia or to East Timor. They just split the booty. So it's a nice way, particularly for major powers that don't want to be seen to be defeated in an international forum. And I'll remind us that we walked out of Nicaragua, so major powers don't like to be overruled by international organs. Why would China not want to take that as a safe haven? And finally, let me just ask one other. This is the academic in me now, not the politician. But an academic, an impractical academic, might ask, is it, and I'm very sympathetic to the Philippines case, let me say, and I think it has complete merit, but is it wise, from an institutional point of view, to have an arbitration if you, in a relatively new regime, if you think a major power may defy it? Couldn't you break the whole machine by pressing China to be more legal than they currently have an inclination to be? I mean, law in China is a complicated idea. There's statutory law, there's juridical law, and then there's kind of a political law. So, but with that, to my friend Bellinger.
Thanks, Ruth. Ruth is always provocative. I will try to keep my remarks extremely short so that we can get Patrick back on schedule. And in addition, because I am the least expert on these issues of all of our distinguished panelists, I'm a bit more of a generalist than a specialist, so it's been interesting for me to hear their comments. Also, many of the most recent developments and the new tensions and troubles in the South China Sea and East China Sea have come up since the time that I left the government. I'm going to just make 3 comments about U.S. interests in the region and then 2 comments about dispute resolution. Of course, the primary U.S. interest in both the South China Sea and East China Sea disputes is to avoid a conflict amongst the parties, and we constantly are urging the parties to reach peaceful settlements. Even more important for us is to not get pulled into one of these conflicts, and of course there is a risk of that because of our defense commitments both to Japan and to the Philippines. And you will have seen that over the last 4 years, really since the time I left office, there have been increasingly vocal statements by U.S. government officials reaffirming the defense commitments and then also clarifying what those defense commitments extend to. I still think there is some ambiguity. Ambiguity in diplomacy can sometimes be useful, and it can sometimes even be useful when it comes to the extent of a defense commitment. It's not clear to me that too much ambiguity, though, is useful for us here. So I think in general I would agree with Professor Dutton that greater clarity from the U.S. is useful, and I think we're seeing that. The Legal Advisor's Office, which I headed, is in the center of developing these statements, and I think you see that they are now coming more and more frequently. A second issue is something that we didn't touch on because we've mostly been talking about the interest amongst other countries, but that's the U.S.'s own interest in resolving its disagreements with China over U.S. military activities in China's exclusive economic zone. Interestingly, this was one of my first personal crises when I was the NSC legal advisor in April of 2001 before life got really complicated after 9/11. But in April 2001, of course, was the EP3 incident, and there have continued to be these incidents between the U.S. and China, with the U.S., of course, asserting its right to freedom of navigation, including for military navigation through and over China's exclusive economic zone, and China being in a handful of countries who insist that it can control military activities in its exclusive economic zone. Professor Dutton's a particular expert in these issues, having come out of the Navy, but I think this is something where, in terms of dispute resolution between the United States and China, we have been talking to each other, but that to avoid these kinds of incidents, we need to continue to work on those. Time permitting, I'd be interested in his thoughts on how we're coming along on that. Third, and of particular interest to me, is the relevance of these disputes to U.S. ratification of the Law of the Sea Convention. I led the interagency review for the Bush administration in the first term, which led to President Bush's support for the Law of the Sea Convention, and I testified in both 2007, and then Secretary Kerry asked me to come back again last year to explain why the Bush administration, which many people thought was not a fan of treaties, in fact supported the Law of the Sea Convention. I agree with both Ruth and Professor Dutton that that these disputes in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, China's actions in its exclusive economic zones and expansive claims are yet another reason for us to join. It is much easier for us to complain with a treaty-based right rather than to simply say that China is violating either its own obligations that are not obligations to us or customary international law. So I think that's very important for us to do. Finally, 2 comments on dispute resolution. Of course, the Philippines arbitration is fascinating. I applaud what the Philippines have done here. I am disappointed that China so far has rejected the jurisdiction of the court. I hope that they are going to continue to reconsider, since they have not had a chance to block it so far. Now, interestingly, China has been somewhat more engaged in both tribunals. Actually, in the United States, they used to not even want to appear in the United States in court proceedings, and for the first time appeared to make comments in the advisory opinion case involving Kosovo. Now, that, of course, was not a case directly involving China, but still that was a first for China. And I think the points that were made about even China's reputation, these are issues that are of concern to them. So I'd like to see them come to the table, at least to argue the jurisdictional issues. We'll see what they decide to do. Of course, the jurisdictional issues, whether the tribunal has jurisdiction at all, given China's exceptions, will be interesting. It's possible the tribunal may decide it doesn't have jurisdiction. If it decides it has jurisdiction and rules in favor of the Philippines, then we'll have to see whether China would simply ignore what the tribunal decides. And then finally, a point again that Professor Dutton made, which I think is an interesting one, is will this case, this arbitration case, be a catalyst for settlements of some of these other disputes? I mean, this is, of course, classic in what we see in litigation in the United States. Plaintiffs bring cases, frankly, never expecting that they are going to win at the end, but that it will put pressure on the other side to come to the table to reach some sort of an agreement. So query whether China will just ignore this and take it all the way to the end, or whether they will try to reach some sort of an agreement, not only with the Philippines, but similarly with the Senkakus, with, at least with respect to sort of rules of the road around the island. So I think this is a useful development in terms of international law, this arbitral proceeding. The big question will be, will China participate? And whether it participates in this, will it put greater pressure on it to reach some sort of bilateral agreements?
I'm interested in Henry's slides, where the Philippine claim doesn't give any attention to the potential for territorial sea and possibly even exclusive economic zone around some of the islands in the South China Sea. And I'm wondering how you account for that in your thinking about coastal state claims and China's 9-dash line.
Sure. With respect, when you look at the SPRATLYS group of islands, actually, and depending on who the author is, it's a group of islands whose features could number anywhere between 65 or 195. It really depends on who makes the counting, whether you count it individually or by clusters. 95 to 98% of these, even 99% of these, is sure enough to be not an island. I think this is important in the context of Article 121 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Some may have known it, but very quickly, let me go over this. In terms of, again, the operating principle is that the land dominates the sea, and he who owns the land owns the sea around it and have some sovereign rights to a certain extent. To this, therefore, it is very important to know what is the character, first and foremost, of that feature. If it is a low tide elevation, in fact, it does not generate anything at all. And in some case law, even jurisprudence has it that low tide elevations are part of continental shelves, in fact, and therefore are not considered to be subject of appropriation. What that means is there could not be a territorial dispute on that. In one case even, the Qatar versus Bahrain, all the proximity is not actually a basis for making a claim. In that particular case, when all things being equal, it was adjudged to be part of the state where it is closest to. So these are some of the jurisprudence. Going back to the characters of the features, in terms of racks, actually, they do not generate 200 nautical miles. Theoretically, they can only go as far as 24 nautical miles in terms of territorial sea plus contiguous zone, but nothing more than that. An island will generate the maximum of 200 nautical miles. But the question here is, what differentiates islands from, which is a natural form island, artificial islands are excluded from this, from racks. And there is a phrase that makes that, and lawyers are very good in making these phrases. An island, a feature that is not capable of sustaining human habitation on its own and economic life on its own is not an island, it is a rack. And therefore, the definition of a rack is not determined by the size of that, but by this phrase. This phrase, unfortunately, has not been clarified yet, and maybe this is an opportunity for the tribunal to make a difference in terms of playing a role in defining what exactly it is. Going back to the SPRATLYS, I said many of these features are, number one, are not really islands in the context of being able. Many of these islands have people in them simply because they are artificially supported by the mainlands. And so it is important, therefore, to understand the character of these features in the context of the 9-9. Why? Because when you look at the 9-9 without making reference to the features, you're not sure what exactly is the basis of the 9-9, especially if there is no clarification from the one making that claim. Is this a claim to the sea on its own, or is it a claim to the land? If it is a claim to the land, the extent is about 870 to the southernmost tip. Now, this is not consistent with the 200 nautical miles limitations by UNCLOS, obviously. So therefore, what is the basis of that? Is it because of the features as well? Now, that's very ambiguous, and therefore, it is very important now, in order to clarify 9-9, I have to clarify the features. For me to be able to prove that this is black, I have to prove that this one is white. And so by doing and going through that process, you're able to clarify what is the source of that. And in the process, therefore, enable yourself now to understand that ambiguity in a significant way. Now, let me refer, therefore, to the idea of why did we go through arbitration, and why is it necessary for us to go through this arbitration? Because I think we're not better off right now with this ambiguity. We can get on roller coaster. All right. But I think the ability of the arbitration now is it will put all of us, and this is consistent with Peter, what Peter has said, it puts us on a level playing field and on the same page and on the same channel. Maritime delimitation,
Can I offer a
therefore.
comment on some of the things you've laid out? So sorry to interrupt you.
That's okay, Peter. That's okay.
So I have 4 quick comments about the law related to this. One is talking to legal scholars who have looked carefully at this, they estimate that at least 4 of the islands in the South China Sea should probably be entitled to an exclusive economic zone, 2 in the Paracels, 2 in the Spratlys, depending on how you look at it. But on any reasonable reading of the law, probably 4 of them are entitled to an exclusive economic zone. And so that, at least in part, calls into question whether there is a significant or, a major high seas portion in the South China Sea, regardless of who actually ends up with sovereignty over those features. Second, the Colombia-Nicaragua case made clear that no matter how small a feature, as long as the feature's above water at high tide, it generates a 12-mile zone. And in that particular case, they looked at something that was about half a meter above the water at high tide and half a square meter, if I'm remembering, less than 1 square meter in size. So in other words, a rock the size of one of those chairs, right, is subject to a sovereignty claim by a state and therefore generates 12-mile zones. So the third point I want to make is that essentially what that means is that no matter how we look at the South China Sea, it's more like Swiss cheese, that there might be competing claims around these islands as to what the status of the waters is, but there certainly are sovereignty claims that will generate 12 miles around it. And then the fourth point I want to make is that I disagree a little bit with your characterization of the low tide elevations, the rocks, because if they are within 12 miles of another rock that is subject to a sovereignty claim, they can actually affect the baseline and therefore change what is actually susceptible to a claim to territorial sea. So in other words, and for instance, this would make a big difference in Scarborough Shoal, for instance, right? Because we know that on Scarborough Shoal, I think there are 5 rocks that are above water at high tide. But there are many rocks that are above water at low tide. And so they could be considered low tide elevations that would shift the baselines depending on who claims ultimate sovereignty over those 5 rocks. So these are very important points to recognize that rather than a rather simple approach to maritime jurisdiction based on the coastal zones, we have to think of the complexities within the South China Sea and sort those through first. That's just my comment.
Two last closing observations just on international law and politics in general. This is just speaking for myself, not for any entity or government. But I do think personally that the law of the Sea Convention shows why it may not be a wise practice. It's legal practice, but not a wise practice to have treaty texts that never permit reservations, because then you're giving countries a choice of being in or out, whereas you can humor a lot of friction in life and still have the basic intention of a regime. So for future legal advisors, I tell them don't sign stuff that has no reservations, or read reservations to include understandings, interpretive understandings. You can have interpretive understandings and no reservations. And secondly, never overestimate, I think, that the degree, and I support the Philippines' position, I say, but in general, never overestimate the clarity of the text. In particular, just the famous old prowler problem, the EP6, I guess it was A6, EP3. EP3, yeah. In the territorial sea, you can't collect intelligence. It says so in plain text. In the EEZ, you can't do anything that prejudices the interests of the coastal state. So I'm not taking this position, but an inventive Chinese lawyer could, to say that many of these unresolved disputes were smoothed over, but only temporarily, by ambiguous language, so that signing a treaty does not get you to the end of the regime of treaty formation. It really is a constant conversation in which politics and a certain deafness, you can't push China. They're just too big, but a certain deafness of deferring things that don't need resolution if the resolution is going to be provocative to one of the major powers involved in the regime. So thank you all for great presentations.
Ruth, I want to especially thank Jay Batongbacal.
Indeed.
He was not able to travel here to the United States, but we did our best to simulate jet lag by keeping you up all night in Manila. Anyway, thank you very much. We're going to reconvene in 5 minutes, so thank you.
Thank you.